Broadcasting from Orchard Park, New York,
and Boca Raton, Florida,
it's the Freight 360 podcast. From freight broker sales tips to sports talk, this podcast is all about helping you grow as a freight broker. We're your hosts, Nate Cross
and Benjamin Kowalski.
Let's talk freight. All right, Ben, we usually start off by saying welcome back for another episode, but I'm going to start by saying show me the money. We're going to have a great episode with a guest today talking about compensation plans, and we'll get into that shortly. But hey, if you're brand new, you caught us at a fun 213th episode. We got our entire library at freight360.net full of other content, blogs, YouTube videos, full-length podcasts. Continue to share us with all your friends and colleagues in the industry. Leave us that review, whether it's a thumbs up or a review on Apple Podcasts or a comment on YouTube or wherever. And if you want to learn more about us and training options, check out the Freight Broker Basics course. It's a full-length, self-paced course online where Ben and I run through how to start a brokerage, build up a customer base, carrier base, and even hire the right employees, which we'll have a good book for you to read if you do decide to hire some employees. So this episode is brought to you by Blue Book Services. Are you looking to quickly identify qualified sales prospects? Looking to develop trusted, sustainable business partnerships? Well, look no further. The Lumber Blue Book is an online directory and credit resource for the lumber and forest products industry, covering mills, manufacturers, wholesalers, and retailers. Their database of over 23,000 lumber companies can be searched and segmented to develop sales and marketing campaigns. Members receive access to real-time credit and business information for companies throughout the industry. To learn more, go to lumberbluebook.com and click join today. That's lumberbluebook.com. Whew, that was a mouthful of an intro. Ben, how are you today?
Doing well. Can't complain.
Awesome. So, hey, without further ado, we have a special guest with us today, Beth Carroll. And Beth, here's my title I have for you that I curated myself. You are not just the owner of Prosperio Group, but you are also the author of Taming the Compensation Monster, Using Freight Broker Compensation to Drive Urgency, Performance, and Profit. So, Beth, for anyone who doesn't know you, feel free, take a quick second here and tell us who you are, what you do, and we're just glad to have you.
I'm glad to be here. So I have been developing incentive compensation plans now for over 25 years. I started with a big HR consulting firm that is now Willis Towers Watson. Back when I was with them, they were Towers Perrin. But that's how I learned to do what I do. Most people don't realize that there actually is a formalized discipline around sales incentive compensation. And there's actually broad-based compensation and executive compensation as well. Those are three tracks that people generally can be in if they're in one of these firms. And so I have all of the official training and certification and all that kind of stuff. And then at the beginning of 2008, I left Towers to start my own company. Coincidentally, I was working with a freight broker at the time, and that relationship just sort of blossomed. And I have now worked with over 300 transportation and logistics companies developing their incentive plans. And as you said, I've written a book on freight broker compensation. So I've heard myself described. I was wondering what you were going to say with my title, because I've been called the compensation lady, the compensation guru. I like to describe myself more as a Sherpa, in that I've been up and down the mountain a bunch of times, 300 times plus. I won't climb it for you, but I can help you climb it and make sure that you don't fall off the cliff and die. So that's my job.
Love it. Well, we're going to definitely get into your book. Ben and I recently read it, and we were introduced to you by another a mutual person in the industry who said, you got to go talk to Beth. She'd be great to have on the show, and I'm glad we did. So good stuff. I'm excited for the conversation. Switching gears to sports. Beth, you already told us off air that, not a big sports person.
Only if it's UFC.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, I'm not an expert on UFC, but I wouldn't have pegged you for UFC. But that's awesome.
My husband's
the compensation lady / the UFC.
Well, I actually am a brown belt in karate, but my husband's an 8th degree black belt. So
that's cool. Nice. So sports. I'm a big Buffalo Bills fan, and the Bills had a very sad performance in London this past weekend against the Jacksonville Jaguars. And I'm going to keep it at that. A couple of injuries. Ben, how about the Steelers, man?
Steelers were able to pull off a win against the Baltimore Ravens and go into the bye week and tied for first place in NFC North, which was unexpected, but hey, a win's a win is a win. So
it is a
is what it is.
It's a long season for sure, but
That it is.
all right, I'm going back to my Buffalo Bills on this one because I'm not over it. There was the Bills lost 25-20, and after like 3 straight weeks of just blowout wins against teams, and went down early like 11-0, and come to find out like there was coaching errors made on when to fly to London. These guys were jet lagged. They took a red eye flight and got there like Friday and had to play on Sunday and weren't acclimated yet. They're complaining about the turf. I mean, you can complain about whatever you want. They just didn't perform right. I don't care if you're tired or if the turf is different. You don't get embarrassed the way that they did. And probably some play calling, and I don't know. This is what it is. We had Matt Milano go out, who's like the number 1 linebacker in the league. Possible season-ending knee injury. But Bills are playing Sunday Night Football on Sunday this weekend in Orchard Park against the Giants, and I will be there. I have not seen the Bills lose in Orchard Park since before COVID. So keep my fingers.
Knock on some wood, brother.
I've gone to a lot of their games, so maybe I'm the good luck. Anyway, anything else in sports?
That was all I had. Some little bit in news. It got released last week. ChatGPT now sees and speaks. I don't know if it's widely available or if it's just through some like users' accounts, but it's like they're transitioning from just the chatbot right into literally being able to interact with it more directly. I'd heard they were talking about moving into having a better app to be able to like literally talk to it. And again, it's moving in that direction. The fact that it's able to speak and see, and I've heard some reviews that it's still making some errors, but I mean, it's moving pretty quickly from where it was to where it is. And to me, that is pretty shocking to be able to.
It was released less than a year ago too, right?
Yeah. Like November, give or take November, December of last year.
So what's funny is, a lot of our listeners know I'm also in the National Guard for the Army, and I got to go play Army this weekend, and I'm in a course right now where I'm running we're writing a lot of papers for stuff. I just did one on history, and I've used ChatGPT to help me like rephrase things and rewrite things grammatically correct. And they were just releasing this big statement saying that like, if we find AI generated content, we're going to consider it like plagiarism. And I'm like, it's kind of freaky because I'm like, it's a really cool tool. I'm using my own original ideas and just refining them with AI, but it begs the question, is it, can I like add a citation that I've used Chat GPT as?
What's interesting is also in recent news with that, right? Like the writers' strike and, Hollywood and media, right? That was just ended is the first major industry to have contract that actually has clauses that protect their industry from AI. And you can go and find them and literally see how they've lined it out and how they're using it. And again, the thought is that will be kind of a benchmark, at least to start with, into other industries, into how and who can use it, when, and what constitutes, to your point, as plagiarism, what constitutes, leaning on as a tool or a crutch, because the writers, I think, are allowed to use it. The studios are not, but there are also, I think, clauses on how the writers are able to utilize it. So in your case, from the way I read it, like it would be able to be used by the writers to be able to help them work on things, but it's more of a tool for the profession, not a replacement for it, is I think the spirit of.
For sure. I got 2 other freight related news items here. TIA, I think just today released a new model broker carrier contract. So if you're a TIA member, you get free access to that. If you're not, we're great friends with them and recommend joining that organization, but they put out a lot of good model contracts for shipper, broker carrier, co-broker. They just released a new one today. And then in other news also regarding TIA, that obviously 2 weeks ago, I was down in DC at the policy forum, and I've gotten really good feedback from the folks on Capitol Hill that I personally met with from the state of Tennessee. I want to read a blurb I got from one of the staffers. He sent it to me yesterday after I followed up with him. He said, "I do have an update for you. I'm drafting an appropriations amendment for the transportation bill that would call out the rampant fraud in the supply chain and DOT's lack of action. I need to run this up the chain to Congressman Green for his final approval, but we hope to add pressure to the Department of Transportation and bring national attention to this issue. So last year we were in DC, and they're like, what's a freight broker? And now they're like, they're in the fight with us trying to help combat the fraud. So good news on the forefront there. So
last thing I had on the tech side too, and I don't know if this is available. I think it's available for some of their big accounts. I heard Lex Friedman is one that are trying this out with, but Spotify is working on an option that will translate podcasts into other languages with the original speaker's tone of voice, right? So let's say you're listening to Lex Friedman and you're in Ukraine or you're in wherever, Uruguay, you're going to be able to go and just toggle the language and you will hear his voice speak your language right in that podcast, which will clearly, I think, help our show. I know we have a lot of foreign listeners and I was like pretty excited when I heard that, but I think it's also going to have wider impacts into the movie industry and things with voice actors and stuff, because again, if you watch movies even on Netflix now that are dubbed internationally, like it always bugs me to like kind of read it and that their voice tones or don't match up with their mouth. And I'm like, that would be really cool to be able to literally hear the actor's tone of voice, even in films, right? And again, as fast as it's coming, I can't imagine they're not going to be somewhere close to that in the next 6 months to a year. So another cool thing on the tech side.
I want to hear Freight 360 in Spanish. That'll be a good one. I'm actually looking it up because I do not speak Spanish, but carga is freight, I guess. And I don't know how you would say 360 in Spanish, but carga 360. Anyone, we definitely have some Spanish-speaking listeners.
Yeah.
Feel free to spam our inbox with just how terrible my attempt at speaking a second language is. So, good deal. Well, hey, let's give a shout out to DAT, and we're going to talk compensation with Beth.
Tired of struggling to find accurate rates and the right carriers for your freight? With DAT1, you can access more than 500 million posted loads and trucks every year. That's 3 times more capacity than any other load board. Plus, their integrated freight management system makes it easy to cover loads 24/7. They have the most trusted network of carriers, brokers, and shippers in the industry. You'll get real-time rates on every lane so you know exactly how much a shipment will cost before you commit to it. Plus, you get instant access to top bids from qualified carriers around the country. Get 10% off your first year with DAT1 when you visit the link in the show notes.
Absolutely. All right, Beth Carroll, the compensation Sherpa, as we'll call her today. I want to start off with, you kind of gave a background on how you got into the world of compensation and specifically freight brokerage. What was it about freight brokering that you're like, you know what? I think this is the road I want to go down as far as like my niche with compensation. Was there like something that attracted you to it? Did you know what it was before? Was it,
I had no idea, not a clue. So it was when I was still at Towers. It was actually CRST Logistics. They reached out because they'd used Towers for their executive comp work. And the head of brokerage wanted to look at maybe doing something different with their freight broker plan for the customer side and the carrier side. And so they called and asked Towers, hey, do you have anybody who can help with this? And I always liked kind of quirky, smaller clients, and to Towers, they were small. And so I got sent out to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and that's where I started learning. I didn't know a thing about trucking. I just knew there were trucks on the road. That's all. Didn't understand anything about how it worked. And so I started working with them in 2007, started my own company in 2008. 2009 is when I spoke at my first TIA conference. And I always tell the story. Everybody knows Cindy Amos, love her to death.
Yep.
When I was being signed on to speak at the conference, I had a conversation with her and she said, well, speakers still have to register. You still have to pay the $600. And we had just started my company. I had like no money. And I was like, what am I going to get out of this? I don't even know that I should go, and I almost said no. And that would have been a horrific mistake because I was thinking, nobody else is going to hire me. I don't even know what these people really do. And so I went and spoke at the conference. I got my second client over lunch right after I spoke. I had my third client within another week. And then now it's over 300 that I've worked
with. That's $600 you could have spent.
I know that would have been a colossal mistake if I had not done that. But what I liked, so first off, there was a need, right? So there was no service among the consulting world to think about freight brokers as a target market. there's a lot of misconception about the industry. So some of my colleagues from Towers and some Mercer and Hewitt and those, the other big firms, they kind of look down their nose at it. They think it's very simple, right? It's very, trucking. It's pedestrian. It's blue collar. It's not exciting and snazzy. They want to do banking and insurance and software sales comp. And so that left a void, which I'm like, hey, I can handle that. I can create my own blue ocean here. And I really have always liked the underdog. I've always liked sort of the quiet, like people overlook it, right? They don't understand how important it is to the way the country functions, transportation in general and supply chain and logistics. Most people just don't know anything about how it works. And so I like that it's sort of like this, it has this underdog characteristic to it, that it's so vital. It's so vital, but it is so overlooked. And so those things combined just really fit with my personality. And I'm somewhat of a frustrated professor. At one point, I wanted to be a college professor. And so having that opportunity to take everything that I'd learned when I was at Towers and figure out how to apply it to this industry and to teach people how to think about incentive compensation in more of a structured way, it really hit on all buttons for me. So it's been like a great win-win circumstance in my life. Serendipity for sure.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I've been in the brokerage world for about a decade now. I worked for an asset-based company for a few years before that. And until I read your book in the last month, I had no idea of like I didn't even comprehend the possibilities out there for different directions to take a compensation package or just the organization of it. I always thought, agents get a flat commission and W-2s get a base pay plus a flat commission, and that's it. Never thought, because, and again, if you haven't checked out Beth's book, it's called Taming the Compensation Monster, using freight broker compensation to drive urgency, performance, and profits. We'll put a link in the show notes. It's on Amazon, right?
Yes.
Or I got it on Apple Podcasts. If you want to hear not Beth read it to you, whoever the voice actor was, she did a fine job portraying the content. But I'm reading through it and I'm like, wow, there's so many different options, because I've seen FreightWaves put out articles and statistics on what the average freight brokerage compensation package looks like, average starting salary, the average commission percentage, things like that. And I've talked to various people throughout the years, and they'll tell me, I get paid X percentage once I hit this certain tier, and I have a base salary. Some people have a draw, and it's like you don't have to be confined to just what everyone else has been doing. And clearly you've Sherpa'd, as we'll say, 300 some freight brokerage and logistics companies figure out what the best model is for them. Ben, I want to actually ask.
There is no best model, right? You said it perfectly. It's what's the best model for them.
Yeah, for sure. So Ben, I want your input, because I've been talking too much here, but because you started at a W-2, did you, what did you think compensation looked like across the board?
So yeah, to me, I came from those industries. I came from banking and finance and accounting and economics. So I had a lot of frustrations in a big organization because I was angry and frustrated that they couldn't utilize more sophisticated comp plans to get more done. I would be frustrated that I couldn't get more out of teams because they were just very flat and vanilla and not dynamic, and left a lot of opportunity on the table. And that was one of my biggest frustrations at working in a large organization. It was exactly what you hear, right? It's this way because it's the way we've always done it, right? And the reality was, there were so many opportunities for the company to get more, for employees to be incentivized to do more, but they never really thought about it that way, right? They really thought about it more from, how do I get more from every person in here? Every person we hire should be a revenue generating employee. How do you get more or kick them out the door? And that's how they manage the expenses for the most part, as opposed to looking at the overall. Again, what is the purpose of having an incentive in the first place? It's to incentivize one behavior over another one, right? And I don't think that question was ever asked or thought through. It was just, this is the number that works and we're going to keep running with it, right? So when I was reading through the book, right, there are lots of things that just jumped out at me. And it's just this makes so much more sense for so many different reasons, right? In a lot of different avenues. And that's where some of my questions are that I was looking forward to asking you is, what would you say are, and I thought through this too on how I even wanted to ask this question. Like when you work with a company, right, you bring on a client, right, read through your books and all of the math and all of how it's structured, right? And I've got a pretty good grasp for somebody that's read it once and hasn't like gone through and implemented it. But for you, right, and I do consulting and Nate does on a practical basis too. My first question is like, what do you ask and how do you approach a new client from like a conversation before you get to even the stuff that we could talk a little bit more in detail? Like what are your first steps in understanding them?
Yeah. So understanding what their needs are, I'll ask them about what it is they want to be different. So if they could imagine, I ask them to explain their compensation plan now, like how do they currently do it? And then I'll say a year from now, if we put in a new compensation plan, what is different about your organization, right? So that helps me understand, are they trying to motivate a different type of behavior? Do they feel like, I often hear we don't have enough new customers, we don't have enough penetration of our existing accounts. Maybe their margin percentage isn't what they would like it to be. Maybe their load count isn't what they would like it to be, right? So I try to get at what is the problem that they're trying to solve, because changing compensation is a big pain in the butt, right? It is a nightmare to do it. People do not want to have their compensation packages changed, particularly if anybody's making a lot of money under the plan. Then they get really entrenched into the way the pay is delivered. And even though there may be perfectly viable ways to deliver even more pay to them, they don't want to change, right? So you have to have
change is scary.
Change is very scary. So
both sides.
You have to have a burning platform. Like this isn't something to just do because, oh, it's the trend, right? Everybody's talking about changing their compensation plans. And so, the new thing of the day or the year or whatever is to do this. You have to really have a business case for doing it and to know that you're going to have some pain going through this process. You may lose a couple performers. Probably it's okay. People always freak out about that. And usually it's not nearly as bad as they imagine it's going to be. So figuring out what it is that they want to be different, and then what can they measure? So two of the most important that I say all the time to my clients, I say, tell me what you want people to do and tell me what you can measure. And with those two things, we can come up with pretty much any compensation plan you want. I cannot put a compensation plan in place if what you are asking me for is something that you can't measure. I actually have a case study right now of that, where they're making up something. They've never measured it before. They don't know how to set goals, but they wanted me to put together a compensation plan for this. And I'm like, what do you want me to do?
Yes.
Can you talk through some of those metrics that are measurable? I mean, to give an idea of like the ones that come to mind, I always just thought it was gross profit. Like we're going to pay someone off a gross profit, but you already mentioned a couple other ones, right?
Yeah.
Number of new customers, penetrating existing customers. Can you talk through some of those measurable metrics that people can think about, including in part of their comp?
And gross margin. And when we're talking freight brokerage, gross margin still reigns supreme, whatever you call it, whether you call it gross profit, gross margin, net revenue, spread, brokerage, whatever. It's called all different kinds of things, but it's revenue minus purchase transportation. It's the dollars that a brokerage uses to run the business, right? That has to be a fundamental element in the majority of the incentive plans because it's really what matters the most. But you can also have gross margin percentage as a component. You can have load count. You can have revenue. I use that rarely. Every now and then revenue does come up. Potential more for like account manager type roles in combination with gross margin, right? I very rarely move away from gross margin entirely. And then we can get into what I call secondary metrics. And that's going to be things like new customer acquisition, new carrier acquisition, new lanes and locations acquired, repeat carrier usage, things that are really about the how, right? So the primary metric is the what. You delivered the benefit to the company in terms of some measurable financial result. But the secondary component that should not be ignored in a good compensation plan is how did you get that financial result? And the classic example is if you have two sales reps who both generate $1 million in gross margin for the year. One does it with a client that they acquired 5 years ago. And maybe 5 years ago, that client was a $5 million client. And now that client is a $1 million client, right? And you have another rep who generated $1 million, and they did it by adding a bunch of new customers, and they're actually growing. Last year, they were only $500,000. Under a straight line commission plan, both of those reps are going to be paid exactly the same amount of money. And there is a clear and demonstrable value difference between what those two reps are giving to the organization.
They're also different jobs, right? If you're managing an account that was handed to you is a completely different skill set than I've got to go find, bring in, and literally hunt to bring accounts in the door, right? Difference in effort, different in skill sets. Not that one is better than the other, but they are not the same, right?
They're not the same, but in my example, they were both hunters. So that one, they had found that account. They just found it 5 years ago. And they've just basically been sitting on it for 5 years, and it's been shrinking.
Another example, and from your book, was location. And in freight brokerage, it may, we probably see this less because unless someone's assigned a geographical location, but use the example of like someone in New York City versus I think Montana, right? And it's like, well, there's way more opportunity in the New York City metro area versus a rural part of the United States. So, it's a great point though. My first role in brokerage, I was paid off. It was just strictly based off of, it was a profit thing, but we started to implement, like we would do reviews and we'd look at all these other supplemental metrics, and we never ended up implementing them as hey, you've got to hit X, Y, and Z to get paid on it. But we started to analyze things like, well, how do we do year over year compared to last year? And where are we at year to date this year? And, number of accounts, stuff like that were some of the other metrics. And I think it's interesting, and reading through your book was, there were some like really, really complex options for a account plan where, maybe we're looking, 20% comes from this and 50 comes from this. So can you talk through complexity, versus simplicity of a comp plan? Is there benefits to one versus the other? And because you drilled down very deep in that book, and to me, sometimes simple is just easy. And I don't know if it's maybe a shortcut, but
it's simple. It certainly is easier. But in the example that I gave a minute ago, where it was a straight line commission plan, right? Where you have two reps that both generated $1 million and you pay them a percentage of the $1 million. You will pay those two reps exactly the same amount of money, but you're not really driving the right behavior. So then the question becomes, how much complexity are you willing to take on organizationally to provide greater reward to the rep who's actually doing a better job? And so this is one of the challenges that we always have, is figuring out what level of complexity the client can handle. And I've worked with enough of all different size brokers now. If you look at my client list on my website, I need to update it because there's a bunch that are new that are not on there. But I've worked with, a bunch of the big guys and a bunch of small guys and a bunch of in between. And what I've definitely found is that the bigger the company, the less complexity they can handle. Right? It has to be a much simpler plan design. It has to be fairly straightforward, because it just becomes they're already overwhelmed with just the number of payees that they have in the system. And then trying to do something that's more complex just can be too much of a burden.
I was going to say, is it like an HR nightmare? Is that the reason for it? Is it just so many calculations?
It's a calculation nightmare. It's a communication nightmare. It's a management nightmare. It's like you have to be a lot simpler. There are just some plan designs. Like I know the guy that referred me to you, he loves one of my plan designs called a bank. It is the most complex plan design. And I really he thinks it's the solution for everything. And I use it very, very carefully, because there are only a few organizations where it really makes sense for one thing and where they can handle it from a complexity standpoint. So you have to be really careful to understand. It's a bit like being a doctor and prescribing the right kind of medicine. It's like I have to know what works organizationally. And just because something worked great at one company doesn't mean it's going to work great at another company.
So I have a couple questions about that specific thing, right? And the first that I think would be helpful for the audience, right, is to take, I think, the two most common examples and for us to talk a little bit through the pros and cons, right? And let's go through your example. you've got two employees, one that is basically managing an account that is getting smaller every year, and now it's at $1 million that they found 5 years ago. They're getting a flat commission on that. Then you've got someone else that found 5 customers that in aggregate this year did $1 million. They get paid the same, right? And this company, we're going to make up an arbitrary situation that has, hey, we want to grow by 15% this year. Pretty common within the industry. Okay. So both companies, right, have same types of employees. They both pay flat commission percentages, right, for their incentive. And they're both saying, we're not getting enough growth. We're not having our sales reps do enough literally outreach and activity, phone calls and emails and face-to-face appointments to bring in more loads and business to the company, right? So can you talk through the pros and cons just on the simple side? What are the benefits of keeping it simple? I think you've outlined, right? What are the detractors? Like, what is really harming them in the short run from hitting their long-term goal with that incentive?
Well, there's nothing, what the message that's being given to the employees in that organization is sell a lot fast and then just sit on it, right? And just basically milk it. There's really no particular reward for the person who's hustling to get the new customers, other than the future benefit of building up this big book of business that then they're going to be able to just milk for the next 5 years, right? So a very simple solution to that problem would be to say, let's take the base commission rate down a couple notches and let's add a new customer bounty that says when you land a new customer, you can do it a couple different ways. You can do it as a flat one-time payout. The new customer gets to X number of loads. You get an X dollar amount that goes with that. You could do it with an additional kicker commission that says for a new customer, we're going to pay you X percentage, which might be a higher percentage for pick a number 12 to 24 months, right? For a new customer. So that the rep who's actually bringing on new customers will make more than the rep who is not, right? There's more complex ways to solve it as well. You can put in actually growth goals. And if they reach a growth goal, they get a higher commission rate. So the rep who's shrinking would have a lower commission rate than the rep who's growing. And now you've created differentiation in pay.
And I think one of the common things we hear from business owners and things when we get into some of these conversations are like, they're not strategic. They're not bringing longer term contracts or not having. And it's like, I remembered when I was in it and I was the person receiving these and I'm going, well, I don't look at what you say. I look at what you do. And what you do is what's in your comp plan. If you're paying me more for this, tell me all day you want me to do this. You're paying me for this. Yep. This is where my focus is going. Whether or not most people are aware of that, that's what's happening, right?
Absolutely.
And to me, that creates a problem in our industry where most sales reps are constantly on the phone asking, what loads can we get this week? What do you have on your desk now? Because all of the management and the entire structure is geared on a week-to-week basis of evaluation and incentive. So where do you think the conversations are going to be about? What do you have right now? So nobody's even having conversations about the next month or the next quarter, let alone doing anything strategically. And I feel like that is an example of kind of like the decisions created the problem that they come to somebody, anybody, you, us, a consultant to solve. And you've got to get them to see that first. How hard is that for you to get them to see that they're kind of in their own way and that their existing plan is creating the impediment?
Sometimes it's harder than others, but usually if they've reached out to me, they know they have a problem, right? And so I just have to help them understand it. And usually it's a bit like what you guys have said in terms of reading the book, right? I go through my first meeting with a client team will be to go through basically my TIA training stuff where I go through, here are all the different things you can do, right? And I make their heads spin because they've never thought about these different options before. And once they see that it's not just deciding is the rate 5% or 4%, right? That there are lots of different ways they can do things. Then they start thinking and then they realize, oh, I can actually solve some of my problems just by expanding a little bit, but just by, including a goal and not being so transactionally focused.
Got it. I have one other question on that same topic. I don't want to cut you off, Nate, but I was curious while we were on there, right? Do you see the same thing in the agent world that you do in the W-2 world? Because in the agent world, I feel like there's a lot of fluidity and you've got to be competitive to retain somebody as an agent. Are you able to do similar things on that side?
I generally don't. right? And the reason why I don't work with agents is because you have to be very careful about the 1099 agreement and the tax implications there. And if you put in, it's supposed to be an arm's length business arrangement. And so if you put in a very directive, behaviorally oriented incentive compensation plan,
you don't have the control. Yeah.
You actually have too much control, right?
You're creating a W-2 situation and a 1099 situation that isn't.
So it's better. You just should have an arm's length negotiation. Here's our split. Here's the services. An agent is basically buying services from a company, right? They're buying accounting, they're buying freight bill payment, they're buying the TMS system. So they just are paying a fee for you, and that's what it should be. So that's the easy answer for the agents.
I'll hop in on the agent thing in just a second, but first a shout out to our friends at Lean. Is your freight brokerage hiring? If so, read Beth Carroll's book. Just kidding. You've got to check out Lean Solutions Group, the industry leader in nearshore staffing for logistics companies with offices in South America, Mexico, and the Philippines. They offer a wide range of roles from back office operations to web development and marketing. Partner with the best. Visit www.leangroup.com to learn more. That's LEAN group.com. And check out Beth's book because it has a great, it'll get your brain spinning on compensation plan. So back to the 1099, I have seen I had somebody in the past that they worked for a company, they worked for our company as an agent, and they were trying, their previous employer per se, it was trying to sue them for non-compete. She was technically a 1099 for this old employer, but they were being dictated where they had to show up to work, what hours they had to show up to work, and certain metrics they had to hit. And very clearly it got thrown away after a couple of back and forth legal or lawyer exchanges. But you're absolutely right, Beth. It's an arm's length relationship where if I were to tell one of my agents, hey, I'm going to pay you 70%, but if you're in the bottom 50% of our agents, you're going to get only half of that. And, it's like, they'd be like, no, I'm just going to go contract somewhere else as an agent. You know what I mean? Like, you're absolutely right. It's a different beast and it's a different animal.
I've got another question on the other side of that too. So that's on the sales side, right? So on the carrier side, right? One of the most common things, there's two questions I have on this. And one of the most common things that I've seen is it's very difficult to create an incentive structure on the carrier side. And one of the issues is that the lowest margin loads tend to be the ones that take the most amount of time to work on and cover, right? So you end up with the lowest number on the comp. And even if it's a flat rate that you get paid for it, it still doesn't really work on the incentive, because if I'm a carrier rep, my loads, we'll say a lumber load that's got, the skinniest margin of all the freight we're moving today, and that's going to take me an hour and a half to cover. I'm going to cover everything first before I get to it. And even if I cover everything else, there's not a lot of incentive. So usually you will see those loads staying on their load board the longest within a freight brokerage, because again, there's not enough margin for your percentage if you get an incentive like that, or the flat rate because it takes you too long to get it. So they just will step over them until there's nothing else to work on. Can you give an example of an incentive structure that helps address that issue?
Yep. So first off, I'd say, is there an organizational structure solution to this? Can you split out and create a role? Some of my clients have called it Black Ops or SWAT team or something like that, where their job is solely to take the ugly freight. They've got to take the ones that are harder, right? So that way you're splitting responsibility and you're not making somebody make a choice between, do I do the good stuff or the bad stuff? You have a team that their whole job is to do the bad stuff, and you can set up an incentive program that's entirely around that.
That's cool.
How do they draw the line? By commodity typically, or
usually there'll be like a manager that will decide this load is going to go over to the Black Ops team, right? Like they'll put it one side or the other.
I love that.
Or if it hasn't gotten covered, right? It's becoming like a late freight kind of thing, and you've got to get it covered, and it's now upside down. It goes to the Black Ops team. So first, if you can solve it organizationally, that's actually a better solution. But from a comp perspective, if you can't, so small brokers maybe aren't able to do that. It's funny, you said carrier sales is hard to design an incentive plan for. I think it's actually the easiest one. That's the one where it's like...
Well, it was this piece. The rest of it, I think, is easier.
I've got it.
Yep.
So I do, typically for carrier sales, I do a matrix. So one dimension is based on gross margin dollars and the other dimension is based on load count. Okay. And so any loads that they cover, regardless of the margin in them, even if they're negative, they're still going to count toward their load count. Now, what you said is true, right? In that if we're paying them a commission, and most carrier sales reps are paid a commission, a literal commission, where it's a percentage of the profit, a percentage of the gross margin dollars, a negative is still going to be impactful there. Some companies will zero it out, right? They'll say, we're not going to take it as a negative. We're just going to take it as a zero. Or you can add like a modifier or a kicker onto it that basically says, if you covered these loads that we flagged as like must cover, and you've done a certain percentage of them in the month, right? We had 100 loads to cover and you covered 60% of them. You're going to get an extra kicker on top of your calculated commission to make up for that you did more of this harder work that we recognize. And so you can balance it out. You can create reward that people will go, oh, it actually benefits me to work on some of that stuff because it's going to kick my pay up to do it. I'm not a huge fan, by the way, of flat dollar amounts for carrier sales. Not a huge fan.
Yeah.
Flat dollar as in just a straight salary or a
No.
$5 per load to cover, $10.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of that because they'll just figure out the easiest way to get that money. And it's not going to necessarily make any more money for the company. In fact, they could theoretically do that on all negative loads, right?
Well, and it's also difficult to get them to work the margin, right? There's plenty of examples, right? If you even look at a company that does 200 loads a week, right? Getting an extra 10% or 5% off the carrier side, right? Adds up to a lot of money. And it's really hard to incentivize that behavior, right? In that model, because you just get a flat dollar amount. If I can get off the phone quicker, all right, keep the extra $25. I'm going to go cover another load. Exactly. But if I get comp for that extra $25, I will fight a little bit more. And that's what the behavior I think you should be trying to incentivize.
Right.
So I have a fun question for you. I believe it was at the end of your book. You talked about how you applied compensation to your kids in school, right?
Yeah.
Can you summarize that a little bit? I think you have a son and a daughter, and they kind of talk us through that one. I think it's a fun story.
Yeah, no, I have a couple really fun stories. So my oldest was the one who had the most experimenting from me, I think. So he was the one where he loved Hot Wheels cars. And so instead of having the Tooth Fairy bring him money, the Tooth Fairy brought him a Hot Wheels car. And he was so excited by this. The next night, he comes into our bedroom with blood running down his face because he had bashed a tooth out on the board of his bed to get another Hot Wheels car. So
I want to laugh, but one of the things I wrote down when I was reading the book, are you a fan of Freakonomics at all, or Stephen Levitt or any of that stuff?
Both. Yeah.
There's a great story too, where I think it's Stephen Levitt that talks about him potty training, I think his daughter or his son with M&Ms, and he realized that his daughter, right, just wanted the M&Ms, so she was just chugging water all day or just sitting on the toilet to get more M&Ms, and he realized he's like, unintended consequences. Didn't realize I was incentivizing her to hydrate, not really learn how to use the potty. He was like, but I was thinking of that. And again, to that point, what are some other unintended consequences that you've kind of seen, even just in the industry, where somebody thought they were doing something and ended up with something completely different? Oh, wow.
Well, unusual circumstance, which you have to be very careful when you're setting goals. Okay, so I present as diametrically opposed compensation arrangements, a commission structure where you're paying a percentage of the margin and a goal-based incentive plan. They're really not that diametrically opposed, but I present them that way. And a goal-based incentive plan is where you tell somebody, you need to do $1 million and I'm going to pay you $10,000 when you get there. And somebody else has a goal of $2 million and I'm going to pay you $10,000 when you get there. That's the whole New York, South Dakota example, right? So what you're doing is you're balancing out the effort required rather than the financial result. And so people will really latch on to this and they'll go, full bore on goal-based incentive plans, but they don't realize there still has to be economic sensibility to the goal that is being set. So, and I've developed now a mathematical rule for this. So if you have a cradle to grave broker where somebody does everything, they find the customer, they manage the customer, they find the carrier, your goal needs to be, if you take their total compensation, their salary plus their incentive at target and divide it by 0.3, so divide it by 30%, that's going to give you a minimum rational goal for that person, because that means their total pay is going to be at least 30% of what they are producing, right? At most 30%. Sorry, let me say it the other way. Their total pay is going to be at most 30% of what they're producing. In a split model brokerage, do the division by 15%. If you have a triple split where you have customer sales, account management, and carrier sales, you're probably looking at dividing by 10%. Okay. And maybe less on the account management side, because usually they have much, much bigger goals.
And that comes from the round number of cost of goods sold, kind of, right? Where it's like, look, we're going to provide this service. Out of every $100 in margin, we figure that our total cost shouldn't exceed 30% of the $100 that we bring in the door, right?
That's for your sales and operations, because you have to allow 10 to 15% for IT, marketing, HR, all of those people. And I recently did a project with a company that came from more of the agent model, and he looked at it completely differently. It was fascinating. He looked at how much was coming from sales and operations, including all the overhead and the net income. And then how much was coming, well, sales, he had a bucket, and then carrier sales, he had a bucket, and then back office, he had a bucket. So I usually split it by compensation, operating expenses, and net income. He's put all of those into one bucket, but split it by sales, operations, and back office. And so when we put our numbers matrices together, we ended up in exactly the same place for basic brokerage economics. You can't get away from it. If you are paying out, if your cost of compensation is more than 50% of your gross margin, you have a problem in your brokerage.
I would challenge that though, because the pure agent world,
I'm not
70% is like, what's that?
I'm not talking about pure agents. I'm talking about a brokerage where you have to pay accounting and IT. And
I got you.
Yeah. No, I'm talking about.
So your W-2, your in-house model.
Yeah.
That's your basic. Okay.
Right.
Gotcha.
And so even that, so this guy came from the world where you pay agents 70%. I think his was like 67% or something, but it was very close to the 70%. And so he knew that if they were able to keep a third of what they were producing, that would cover his back office costs, right? So he looked at it sort of in those buckets that way. I look at it, compensation as one line, operating expenses another line. But the math is all still the same. It's all the same. And when you have an agent, keep in mind, if you're paying them 70%, you're not paying a salary, you're not paying benefits, right? You have a whole lot of expenses that don't come along with that person. So 70% to an agent is not the same thing as 70% to an internal employee.
Employment taxes, workers' comp, all of it. Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a great point.
I think in the book you say, like, I mean, rule of thumb, like in a W-2, it could be anywhere from 2 to 3 times what the salary is on average. Like the actual cost to a company for a W-2 employee. If they're making 50, the real cost is probably 75 to 100 grand a year for that person, depending on the benefits package.
Think about recruiting, like
real estate, the recruiter,
recruiting,
computer,
like training, turnover.
I have one more question too, and I wanted to make sure I get in here before we run out of time too. So going back to the carrier incentives that you kind of outlined, one of the things that I run into a lot and I've seen is, in smaller brokerages, you see volumes fluctuate quite a bit, right? Volumes of loads, margin on those loads, right? And again, if you've got somebody that's moving towards, we'll call a more robust incentive plan, right, that is able to achieve some of these objectives, right? What do you do in scenarios, right, where for 2 or 3 months or even 6 months at a time, like in the current market, right, the loads that the carrier reps aren't responsible for aren't there to cover? What do you do in these scenarios?
Well, the first question I would say is, what's your pay mix, right? So how much pay mix is how much is in salary and how much is in incentive. It's the ratio between those two things. You want to have enough in salary that you can weather those tough times and not feel like your whole sales force or your carrier sales force is starving, right? I think a lot of the companies that are 100% commission, they feel like they're more protected economically, but I don't think it's actually true, because they're going to have
the opposite.
It's actually the opposite. Yeah, they're gonna have more turnover. They're going to have more risk on the upside for somebody that runs away with the plan. So first look at pay mix. And then I never, ever recommend a binary goal, right? It's never on or off. It's called a performance range around the goal. So there's a threshold, a target, and an excellence level. And the more uncertain you are about your outcomes, the wider you set that performance range. Okay. So if you think about it, a straight line commission plan goes from 0% of goal to 1,000% of goal or more, but there's never any escalation in that payout curve. At 1% of goal, they get 1% of their incentive. At 50%, they get 50%. At 300%, they get 300%. I like tables that have some slope to it, so that at 50% of goal, they get 25% of their incentive. At 150% of goal, they get 200% of their incentive, because now that's going to drive people to perform. I liken the straight line commission, it's to winning a pie eating contest, and the prize is a pie, right? It's like you just get more of the same. There's nothing that's exciting about it. There's nothing different, right? You have to create some excitement and get something where it's like, hey, I reach a higher level, and now I got something more.
I remember one of my first sales jobs out of college. We had it was an escalation. I don't know the term you use, where you hit the excellence level, right? Where if we hit, and I'll just make this up, if we hit 150% of goal for that month, we got like a 200 to 300% payout, and it was awesome. But we also, if we didn't hit our goal, we would still get a lesser percentage, right? We might get if we had 90%, we might get a 75% payout or something like that. So it was awesome, because it wasn't like at month end we just wanted to get to the finish line. We're like, no, how much past the finish line can we get? Because then it just snowballs into a bigger commission. So awesome.
I had one other question as you were talking to that. I was curious. There's a book I was reading on. I really wish I could. It'll come to me after this, I'm sure. It was like, I think it was like two Fritos plants or Doritos plants in this example, right? And they had two comp plans to get production goals on the assembly line. Mm. One was, if you hit 25% increase in your production goal, you get 25% increase in pay. And the other one was, we are going to give you 25% increase in your pay to start. And every week you don't get it, we are going to deduct it from you, right? And the incentive was to try to see if there was a differentiation between fear of loss and hope of gain. And the factory that was given it at first hit the goal every week all year, because if you give me that money, I am not giving it back. And just psychologically, I will do everything to make sure I retain everything you gave me. And the other one, they hit it sometimes, they didn't, right? And you've got far more experience in this. And I've seen this case and I've heard it talked about. And in practice, it makes so much sense from somebody in sales, right? Fear of loss is always going to motivate more than hope of gain. But from a practical standpoint, have you ever seen anything like that actually put into practice in the longer term? And how does that?
Truck drivers. There was a big, like 5 years ago, people were putting in points-based systems where the truck drivers were starting with 1,000 points at the month, and they would lose points based on, speeding and hard braking and whatever other infractions and whatnot that they would have. And so at the ending, whatever their points they ended with the month, that's what determined what their safety bonus or their extra pay was. Okay. I want to know what happened with that Doritos example a couple years later, because fear of loss, I love that wording on it. It's not a good long-term motivation strategy, right? Because there's never a point where you can go above that. All you're trying to do is do what you need to do to not lose. Whereas if you have something, and I would say for the one where you could gain 25%, well, how do I gain 30%? Can I gain 50%? Can I do more? Like, you should never have a point where you say, this is it. This is all you can do. Give them something to reach for, even above and beyond. And in a fear of loss plan, you can't ever have that. There's nothing to go and do better.
Yeah. And it's funny, right? That was the other thing I was thinking too, reading this book, is the thing that really brought me into this industry that made me the most excited as a sales rep back then was, it was the first job I've ever seen that you could literally have uncapped commission. And I'm like, I've never actually seen this in practice in any other industry ever. And like, to meet people making millions of dollars a year, right? I'm like, you just don't see that anywhere. I mean, outside of investment banking, right? And in trading, you don't see those numbers, right?
Usually there's like a maximum. They'll put an arbitrary cap out there. Yeah.
So out of curiosity, just your opinion on that. I mean, how much of that do you think is why some of those things still exist in incentive plans, at least at some of the bigger companies, where they're flat and they're flat indefinite, but in practice, there's things that hold you back from that. But I think it maybe relates more to culture, but I was just curious your
Yeah,
thoughts on
it is.
why they're
When
so
I first started
persistent.
working with this industry and bumped into some of those plans, I like you. It's like I came from places where, oh, well, no sales rep is going to make more than $500,000 a year. And it was just a rule that the CEO wrote down, right? Like there was no particular reason for it other than he didn't want the sales rep making more than he made. But we would usually fight against it. We would argue for uncapped plans. That's a sound sales compensation philosophy, provided that what is being generated is truly beneficial to the company as well, right? So that it's not something that's just an annuity. But I did see, like, I've seen some wild and crazy stuff in this industry. We probably don't have time to get into any of it right now, but I've seen some, not just high payouts. I have no problem with high payouts, but I've seen the way that it's been done being somewhat hair raising from an HR perspective. So I don't mind there being high uncapped payouts. In fact, I think it's a good thing to do. I just want to make sure that the person who is getting that high uncapped payout, if we're talking about customer sales, that they're continuing to bring on new customers, right? That they haven't just devolved to an overpaid account manager.
Yeah, because the way that's solved in practice, at least from what I've seen, is they just start calling them house accounts and they just take them back and they just go, well, you're W-2 and we have the right to do so. So you've been getting paid on this for 6 years and we feel like it's too much. This is a house account. Here's your commission.
Which
like it or lump it.
Right. That's not a good
That's
way
what they
to
do
go about it either. Yeah, I know. But it's not a good thing to do. There's so many better ways to do it by putting goals in, right? You can still pay a commission. You can do a goal-based commission. And by using a goal, now you give something that people can shoot for. And if they're falling short of that goal, then they get a lower commission rate. If they're exceeding the goal, they get a higher commission rate. Very simple.
Yeah, that's good. Good stuff. I have seen people that get lazy and complacent, and Ben, we've talked about it. Eventually, they usually shoot themselves in the foot because they lose the customer, or the customer gets purchased, or something. Right? Something happens, and now their golden goose is gone, and they were never incentivized to do anything different. So
they're either they're rusty or they just were lucky in the first place. Right. And maybe they weren't actually that good of a salesperson. They just happened to be standing in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
But now they believe their own hype, and it's really hard to retrain somebody when it's like, oh, I'm this great salesperson. No, you just were kind of lucky.
Very true. Well, good stuff. Good conversation. Beth, for anyone out there who wants to learn more about you or reach out, we'll have a link in the show notes for your book, but is there a good place to find you, whether it's LinkedIn or your website?
LinkedIn, my website, and my email address. It's beth.carroll, 2 R's, 2 L's, @prosperiogroup.com. Email is always a really good way to reach me.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure we put that in the description box for anyone listening. Well, it was a pleasure having you on. Good discussion. If anyone listening has good stories or questions about compensation, shoot them over our way, and you can always go to Beth too, and she can help you out, and maybe you want to hire her to get things turned around in the right direction for your brokerage. So thanks, Beth, for being on. Any final things you want to say?
All good. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Ben?
Whether you believe you can or believe you can't, you're right.
And until next time, go Bills. That wraps up this episode of Freight 360. Check out the show notes for links to anything that we've referenced on this episode. And make sure to visit us online at freight360.net to see our entire library of episodes, videos, blogs, and more.
And make sure to check us out on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel for daily and weekly tips and content. And if you'd like your question answered on the show, fill out the Contact Us form on our site, and we'll see you next week.